wanted to talk to you a bit today about some disruption that we're trying to accomplish at the Schwartz Reisman Institute for Technology and Society. And I want to start with a story that I'm sure you all know. This is Frances Haugen, the former Facebook insider turned whistleblower who dropped a bomb on social media in October last year, disclosing a trove of internal documents that shone a bright light on the myriad ways in which platforms can pose risks to society, allowing hate speech to go unchecked, contributing to mental health challenges for teens, polarizing political speech, providing vehicles for drug and human traffickers and insurrectionists. And soon Haugen was saying to US Congress things like this: during my time at Facebook, I came to realize a devastating truth. Almost no one outside of Facebook knows what happens inside Facebook. And the result has been more lies, more harm, more threats, more combat, and in some cases, this dangerous online talk has led to actual violence that even kills people. And it's not just social media, and it's not just Facebook. In the past couple of years, you've probably heard or read about unethical AI, things like racist or sexist algorithms that are being used to decide everything from who gets a job or a loan to who gets released early from prison, self-driving cars that are killing pedestrians, facial recognition systems that track people at airports and shopping malls, and powerful AI systems that can figure out from every click you make and every view you take who you are, what you've done, and where you've been online. Nobody who's paying attention is not worried about what is happening with the phenomenal transformation that AI is generating in the modern world. Now, a lot of what you've been hearing about is alarmist. The newspapers that reported on the Facebook papers were as interested in getting outrage excited to generate clicks and views and earn advertising revenues as Facebook is. But less headline grabbing are the stories about how AI holds the promise of improving everything from how we battle a pandemic and provide healthcare to diverse communities, to how we achieve sustainability in the face of climate change, manage our financial and agricultural and commercial systems in more stable ways, reduce accidents and deaths on highways and in workplaces, and more. We are facing a problem with AI, but it's not primarily an ethical problem. It's a regulatory problem. It's just like the problems we face throughout the economy and society. How do we get as much of the good from creative and inventive activity as we can while minimizing the bad and making sure that everyone is fairly treated? Thinking of this as an ethical problem gets us thinking that the solution is to find the unethical people in charge and either lock them up or re-educate them. Thinking of this as a regulatory problem gets us thinking about how we are going to come up with better rules of the game and make sure the rules are followed. And that's what we're doing at the Schwartz Reisman Institute. We're in the solutions business. What research do we need to do, and what new ideas do we need to promote to get in place the legal and regulatory infrastructure we need to make sure that AI really does make everyone better off. And that means we need to understand a lot about how AI works. And the first key thing to know about artificial intelligence is that it is automating human judgment and decision making. Who gets a loan or a job, what news or information people should see first, whether a benefits claim is granted or denied. And doing that well means making decisions that happen faster and make at least as good, if not better, use of the relevant data as humans and human organizations do. Doing that well means making sure that the decisions machines make are the ones we humans want them to make. We call that the alignment problem. Making sure that AI decisions are aligned with human values and goals. But solving the alignment problem doesn't mean sitting around and deciding, well, what those values and goals should be, because we have already lots of different ways of doing that. That's what all the complex structure of our markets and politics are all about. Deciding value questions like how many apartments should we build and what kind and at what price. We look to markets to make a lot of the value choices there. But where those markets don't get us what we want, where they fail to align, is where we turn to regulation. Things like zoning laws and housing codes and rent subsidies and public housing. And we design our political and regulatory infrastructure to try to align those decisions with what we want as a political community as much as possible. That's why I say that the alignment problem in AI is not an ethical problem, although ethics is definitely part of that complex infrastructure we use to resolve questions like what kind of housing are we obligated to provide for people in our community. It's a regulatory problem. And just like we use regulations to get markets and corporations to make the decisions we want them to, we need to figure out how to build the regulatory infrastructure that will keep AI in line. And this is where things get a little tricky, where we face a totally new kind of regulatory challenge. We know how to regulate humans. We communicate rules to them, and then we put penalties on them for failing to follow the rules. But how do you regulate a machine? Of course, we can regulate the companies that make the machines and put the AI into the world. We can write rules for Facebook, and we should. But that brings us to the second key thing to know about AI. AI knows stuff we don't. It does stuff we wouldn't do or wouldn't predict. And that's the very reason that it is capable of doing so much in the world, even better than humans. It can process staggering amounts of data and see patterns we could never hope to see on our own. It can build massive and phenomenally complex mathematical models of the world that humans can't. That's how DeepMind's AlphaGo beat the world champion at Go, and how its AlphaFold figured out the secret of protein folding 50 years before human scientists thought they could. So, how do you regulate something that knows more than you, thinks differently than you, and does things you've never dreamed of? That is a technical challenge, at least as hard as building AlphaGo and AlphaFold in the first place. And it's a regulatory design challenge, much, much harder than anything we've encountered before. Facebook itself is facing this challenge because the way in which its platforms behave in the world is being driven by the massive and complex AI systems it needs to make literally billions of decisions a minute about what to put into a news feed. Facebook may not yet have the right incentives for how to solve that technical challenge, but whatever rules we want to put on Facebook will require complex technical solutions to implement, and ways to integrate those technical solutions with our own regulatory complexity, the challenging questions of how we make trade-offs between speech and safety and fairness and agency and political stability and commercial success. Now, how are we going to find those technical and regulatory solutions? So new that we don't really even yet know how to frame the problems yet. The answer is innovation. We need to drive as much investment and creativity as we can into finding those solutions. And that is why I think we need to be building an entirely new sector in our economy, something standing between the markets, the corporations building our AI, and our governments establishing our collective values and goals. I think we need new regulatory technologies, AI to regulate AI in some cases, like an automated system that continuously audits loan-making AI to make sure it's not discriminating against women or racialized groups, or AI that can figure out what information needs to be deleted from data in order to protect privacy and then automatically deletes it, or AI that tracks the behavior of self-driving vehicles and can automatically adjust how the vehicle behaves, or AI like the one my son's startup is building, a technological interface that would allow users to change the way the AI running platforms like Facebook decides what content to show them. And how will we get that regulatory technology? Well, I don't think we should rely on Facebook to produce it. We can create incentives for it to do so, but relying on them alone to build complex technology, to regulate their own complex technology, That's a bit foolish, sort of fox in the charge of the hen house foolish. And that's the key takeaway for me from Frances Haugen's statement before Congress, that almost no one outside of Facebook knows what happens inside Facebook. Asking Facebook to build its own regulatory technology is like asking the car companies to build airbag technology without regulators having the capacity to buy cars and run crash tests on them, and then having no option but to take the car company's word for it when they tell you that airbags are too expensive or they don't work. I think the solution is something that my co-author Jack Clark and I call regulatory markets. Now, in this kind of market, companies that produce regulatory technologies seek licenses from governments who make sure that the technology is helping to achieve regulatory goals, that it is aligned with democratically set public values. And the companies that need regulation, the Facebooks of the world, are required by governments to buy licensed regulatory technologies and give this licensed private regulator access to their systems and models, which means there's money to be made in figuring out better ways to meet our regulatory goals. And independent expert third parties who are entitled to see and understand what's under the hood. That's how you drive innovation. And a whole new sector with expertise to understand what's really going on inside the companies building the AI that is deciding so much about how our world works. It's how you respond to whistleblowers and make sure that we aren't dependent on whistleblowers to tell us when there's a problem. And that's what we're working on at the Schwartz Reisman Institute. With partners like the Creative Destruction Lab at Rotman, we're helping young startup entrepreneurs to build companies that produce regulatory technologies. We're working with researchers, governments, and AI institutes around the globe to design novel regulatory rules and certification regimes that create the market for these technologies and therefore drive investment into them. And we're supporting research on the leading edge to solve the alignment problem, and working with partners like the Vector Institute to develop engineering tools that show what is possible. At SRI, we are committed to building the legal, technical, regulatory infrastructure we need to make sure that AI delivers on its promises and to make sure that the world is a better place for everyone. So I invite you to reach out to us, to work with us, and help us to accomplish that goal.